All right, this video is going to cover dynamic components within SketchUp and being able to set up a dynamic component to be used with the Cabinet Parts Pro's version 9 Ruby extension. So there are already videos that exist to show you how to use the cabinets that already exist in the 3D warehouse under Cabinet Parts Pro and how to export out to Cabinet Parts Pro. So we'll kind of cover some of that here, but not in great detail. So the first thing that we want to do is see what a dynamic component is. So going into the 3D warehouse, doing a search for Cabinet Parts Pro, these cabinets in this collection of components and models are already set up to work with the extension. So you would just download directly into the sketch. And we have attributes and custom components options for this. So if we right click and come down to dynamic components, selecting options, we see that we have a way to modify the width. And once you apply, we could see that that width changes, and we could also modify height if we want. All of these options that we're seeing here are preset or are getting its real data from the dynamic component attributes. This happens to be not a terribly difficult complex component, but it is a component that is made up of several others. So this video is not going to cover how to create all of these components here. It's just going to cover showing just how to create one component that is the very basic of components. So first, before we do that, let's take a look at how this gets imported. So if we could go to Extensions, Export, CPP Export, and Cabinet Parts Pro will then open up and lay out the cabinets. The first time you bring a cabinet in, it may not know what a base full is. We will then have to tell it that's a base cabinet and follow whatever settings we want. Again, separate video of that. So when we say OK, there it is laid out. We can calculate nest, and it will then nest all of the parts for that particular cabinet. Now that one dialog box that popped up only happens the one time. The second time we do this, it's remembered and it directly opens up. We do not get asked the question of what it is because it remembers what our answer was. So we're going to now take a look at how we could create another component that works like this one here. And before we get into the complicated section, I'm just going to go into the window, 3D warehouse, and we're going to download a basic component from the Cabinet Parts Pro library of cabinets, and that is a wall end. So I'm going to download that directly into the sketch, and we have a basic component. There's not a whole lot to this component. It is only made up of a single component with some variables. So we're going to take a look at how we could create the variables to modify and make our own cabinet component. So we're going to start off with shapes. Going to draw out a rectangle. Then we will use the push-pull to create a sizing for that. So right now, when we select on this newly drawn box, you could select and see these little dots, but notice when we selected here, we did not. And when we select on these components, options over here are changing, but when we select on this box here, it goes blank because it wants us to select a single component. And we have only drawn out a sketch of the box. It is not a component. So I'm going to do just kind of a sweep select to select all of the objects within that cube or that box, right click and make component. We could give that a name. Just call that my base and create. We now have a component that we have and are able to set attributes for that. So the basic attributes that we need for this is we need to modify a way to modify the size in the X direction, the Y direction, and the Z direction. So if we click the little plus sign here, we have the size variables. So you could add them individually by selecting each one or selecting the whole group and add all of them. So this is bringing us to the length X, Y, and Z. We could change these. Tab off of that. The Y, let's go ahead and do 24 inches deep. And the Z, let's go ahead and make that 34.5 inches high. So that is going to represent a base cabinet that is 30 wide, 24 deep by 34.5 high. There isn't, that is the component, but we don't have anything over here in the special components or the component options. And that's what is going to make it more user friendly if we set the component options as we have when we select on one of the components that we've downloaded from Cabinet Parts Pro. So selecting the wall end panel, doing that one because it is a very basic component and it shows the basics in the very minimum of what Cabinet Parts Pro needs to be able to function. So the custom items that we have that are showing up over here are under the custom. And these are the variables that are specific to Cabinet Parts Pro. They do have to have the same name for it to be brought in and imported correctly. Variables are somewhat unique to this component. They are named in a way that makes it somewhat logical for a user to understand what it does, and especially to you or me, or the creator of the component. So when you come back to this component next week, 2 months, or a year later, you look at these components and you're able to see what they are and just kind of understand what the function of that variable is going to be doing just by the name of it. The A, B, C, at the beginning of those, I set those alphabetical order because that is how they show up in our component options, to where I wanted them to be in an order of width and height. For the base cabinet, it's width, height, and depth. So by doing putting the A in the letters alphabetically in front of it, A, B, and C, that is how they're going to show up in our list. So let's first add the critical variables, and we do that by making sure it is spelt exactly the same. So to ensure that, if I double click on the variable name, I could do a Control C, come over here, select the new component, and a Control V, then tab, that variable is there, and just again doing this just to make sure that I'm spelling them correctly, just kind of bouncing back and forth between the two. I am tabbing off after I do the paste. So again, Control C to copy, selecting the new component, selecting an add component, Control V, then I'm hitting tab. That like locks that in. Number of drawers. Of course, it's not going to be used for, well, it could be used for this particular component because we are representing a base cabinet. And the cabinet type, this is the variable that shows up when we import it. So Control C, come over here and add that as an attribute. So notice that even though we have them entered in the same way, we're not getting options here. And also notice that we have more options under the custom than what we have for options. So the custom are just like custom variables. We have the option now to decide if we want to allow the user under the component options, when they're viewing those, we have the option to allow the user to see what we want them to see or what only makes sense for them to interact with. So for our cabinet here, we're only going to have 3 of them. We want the width, height, and depth to be visible for the user to be able to change on options. To do that and set that, we're going to come over here to the options, and I'm going to first set some defaults here. So I'm just going to enter 30 for the base width, 34.5 for the height, and the depth we'll do 24. Number of drawers 0. And the cabinet type, this is our made up word for when we bring it into Cabinet Parts Pro. This is Cabinet Parts Pro then asks us, hey, you have a new cabinet type here. Tell me what that is so I can match it up to the settings of Cabinet Parts Pro. So I'm going to call that my base, and we will see how that works. So now to set them into our component options, there is a little edit box over here. Under details, selecting that allows us to say, well, this unit is a decimal number, and we want to allow the user to edit this in a text box and give it a name. So I'm going to take that letter A out of it because that is only what is going to be displayed. So we apply, and now we have a width. Going to do the same thing for the height. And the depth. And again, this is allowing the user to make the changes. All right, so even though we've done this, this is doing nothing over here other than when we type in something over here that they are now connected to our variable. So you can see when we change that 34, the width over here changed as well, but it is not changing anything to the size of the component that we are working with. The component change happens with the length. So what we now need to do is connect the variable names that we've done here to the length in X, Y, and Z. And we do that by variables. The variables start with the equals and the name of that variable. So we will click over here on our component, and for the X value, we will go equals, and it does need to be spelt in the same way. So we now have a dynamic component that is being set the width based on what the user types in, because you see right when I put that variable in, the size changed. So now when we change the value over here and apply, we are now getting a new width. So we're going to do the same thing for the Y, and again I just select here. I do that quite often for the, make sure I basically get the settings spelt right. So that is the height, and the height is going to be represented in the Z. And then the next one is the depth, which is being represented in the Y. So if we did everything correctly, when we change our values over here in the custom, for the height, if we wanted one that was 42 inches, and then selecting apply, that's going to go up to 42. We could bring that down to 34 and a half, and give it 21 deep and apply. So we could see now we do not and no longer need to have the attributes window opened, closing that, and we could just work with the sizing of this cabinet based on the 3 values that we have here. And now that we have that cabinet set up, we could go into our extensions, CPP export, Cabinet Parts Pro export. And we should be asked a question this time of what is, well, an end panel. That was a new one that we put in from the last time. So I'm going to say that that is an extra part. And that is going to be a filler. And there is the question on the my base. That is the word that we chose to use to describe the component that we just created. And let's call that a base cabinet with 2 drawers and say OK. That has now been entered in, and we could see that there is our cabinet, 21 wide, 34.5 high by 21 deep. And we could see that change by exiting that and just say we want to have that 42 inches wide. And now when we export, it's not going to ask us any questions because remember, once it asks us once, it remembers that. And we will now have a listing of that cabinet to be 42 inches wide, and it dynamically changed and imported into Cabinet Parts Pro for us to be able to calculate and nest those components. So hopefully that made some sense. I will try to do more videos that explain the more complex versions, and maybe even one of just this that is like much shorter in length. So the time, I want to get the overall time of the videos a little bit shorter, but that hopefully explains everything on how you could create your own dynamic component that could be used and work within Cabinet Parts Pro.